Several years ago, Mark traveled to Africa. He toured the country and taught coursework for students at the university. He went at the end of the spring semester in May, and when they arrived, it was the weather of late fall, and everyone was preparing for winter weather. Well, now it's winter here and summer there. It's kind of neat to think about that down there they're celebrating the holidays in warm weather. Below the equator, many people spend their Christmas Day on the beach. In New Zealand, they sing songs like Carol or Christmas. The words are Carol or Christmas, and upside down Christmas. Snow is not falling and trees are not bare. Carol the summer and welcome the Christ child, warm in our sunshine and sweetness of air. Sing of the gold and the green and the sparkle, water and river and lure of the beach. They're singing that lovely carol while we bemoan our chilly weather with songs like In the Bleak Midwinter. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan, earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow on snow, snow on snow on snow, in the bleak midwinter long ago. This is certainly a bleak time of year for us in the northern hemisphere. The weather is cold, we feel isolated, and it seems that one day just rolls into the next. There's little to differentiate from one thing to the next. And now, as we abide by quarantine, these dynamics are multiplied. One day repeating the next, just like in the movie Groundhog Day, where each day begins exactly the same. The radio alarm goes off, the same weather is forecasted, the same options are available for breakfast, the same encounters transpire. In the movie, the character Phil Connors is played by Bill Murray, and he's a cynical television weather forecaster. He covers the annual Groundhog Day event in Puxatawney, Pennsylvania. He becomes trapped in a time loop, forcing him to relive February 2nd repeatedly. This past year, there have been many days that have felt like this, one day rolling into the next. There have been days that we didn't know what day of the week it was, no less what day of the month. Many folks have slipped into having pajama days, days that you just wear pajamas all day long because you have no plans to get out into the world. So what's the point? Or maybe you wear your pajama bottoms and a dress shirt, even if you have to work. Sales of PJs and yoga pants have skyrocketed. It's not how we planned it, 2020. This is the last Sunday of the year. How did your life as it was designed for last year work out? And how are you approaching this next year? Are you interested in designing a new life? This is the question posed by Bill Burnett and Dale Evans in their book, Designing Your Life, How to Build a Well-Lived and Joyful Life. This book seems especially relevant in our lives, where it seems that so much of what we took for granted has been taken away from us. It is often difficult to feel joyful. Our norms have shifted. We feel like a water pipe in our ceiling has sprung a leak, and everything underneath it has been affected. Mark and I literally had that happen to us this year. A water pipe in our ceiling sprung a tiny leak. It was during the first week of quarantine, the first Sunday where we had just canceled church and we were home that Sunday morning. We noticed some water spots in the ceiling area of our office, and Mark climbed up into the attic to investigate. I was standing below. Suddenly, everything came crashing down, soggy plaster, wet drywall, sticky insulation. It landed on books and papers and carpet and me. I felt like Chicken Little. I looked up to see Mark's foot dangling. Everything was okay, but it was all a little bit alarming. It was like that groundhog. That collapse was a prognosticator of things to come. It took a week or two and some help from friends and a professional drywaller, and we had to repaint the whole room, but it ended all right. Wouldn't it be nice if we had messengers who warned us of what was to come so that we'd be better prepared to deal with the onslaught of challenges that would come our way? In the story of the Nativity, a number of times messengers came to share important news to Zechariah, to Mary, to Joseph, the shepherds, to the wise men. They made announcements, and sometimes they offered warnings of challenging days ahead. Speaking of angels, let's talk about angels for just a moment. When we think about angels, an image usually pops into our minds of a glowing individual with a halo and large wings who hovers above the ground or in the air somewhere. The word angel actually comes from the word angelo, meaning messenger. It's interesting because in the Old Testament, angels were understood as messengers of God. Sometimes they were divine beings and other times they were human beings. Sometimes the message came directly from an encounter with God. For example, it's unclear if Jacob wrestled with a man, a supernatural being, or if it was God's own self that he encountered. Remember the story in Genesis 32? It goes like this. Then Jacob was alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." God said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." The man Jacob wrestled with had certainly had a message for him. The prophet Hosea referred to him as both God and an angel. Hosea says this of the encounter: "There at Bethel, he met God face to face, and God spoke to him." In the biblical narratives, God may convey a message personally, in a dream, or through words of another person. The same is true for us today. It seems we rarely receive direct messages from God. We find ourselves in real, tangible situations. We encounter problems and predicaments, yet it is often difficult to understand God's leading, and often our plans don't work out. So how can we approach 2021 with a better plan, a plan to experience more joy and to share it with others? First, let's take a look at our situation. Burnett and Evans suggest that we distinguish between situations and problems. Take a look at your life and decide what you have control over and what you don't. Make a distinction between problems and situations. Problems, or as they term them, gravity problems, are things that you cannot do anything about. Things like gravity, of course. And then the weather, natural disasters, accidents, or events that befall you. Things that you have no control over. Situations, on the other hand, are things that you do have control over, things where your actions can change the outcome. For example, in a tennis match, you have control over some things and other things you do not. You do not have control over the weather or the time of the match or the strength or agility of your opponent. These things they would describe as gravity problems. They are not changeable by us. You do have control over the situation. You can work out, train, you can practice your skills before the game. To sum it up, they say, in life design, if it is not actionable, it is not a problem. If you cannot do something about it, something is not a problem, it is a situation. In our lives, we do not have control over the virus that is impacting our lives. It's a problem. It is a current reality that affects our routines and our relationships and our engagement in the world. We do not have control over it, but we do have control over our situation, however. How we provide our self-care, what precautions we take, what limits do we place on our own exposure and the exposure of our loved ones. In Joseph's life, he also encountered a problem. Matthew 2 says, "After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. 'Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother,' the angel said. 'Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.' That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. Joseph had no control over the murderous whims of Herod. He feared for the life of this child, but he did have control over his situation. He had agency. Although it was definitely not a part of his plan, nor was it easy, he had agency. He addressed the situation. He had the ability to respond creatively. He received the message, and he developed a plan. Once we clearly understand the problem, we can respond to the situation. We can make an appraisal of our situation. We determine what we can and what we can't change. Then we develop our response to the events in our lives. Our responses are shaped by our attitudes. Much of the suffering that we experience is due to our response in the situations of our lives. For example, think of an upsetting interaction, maybe a conflict or an insult that you experience in a store or at work or even in your car. The interaction may have transpired in only a few moments, but what happens afterwards impacts us. Where do our minds take us? Our minds tend to dwell on frustrations. They weigh us down. It seems that the ancient writer of Proverbs 27:3 understood the frustrations of dealings with these types of situations, saying, "A stone is heavy and sand is weighty, but a fool's provocation is heavier than both." Recently, I learned a new word. It may be familiar to you, but in case it's not, I would like to introduce it to you. Perseverate. To perseverate is to prolong an action, thought, or utterance after the stimulus that has prompted it has ceased. It's a cousin of rumination. Have you experienced this? A personal injustice might prod you to wake up in the wee hours of the morning, and your mind turns it over and over. And this perseverating can continue on throughout our day, even when we're involved and engaged in other activities of our lives. It can steal hours from our days, weeks from our lives, and actually, if we allow it, it can steal the joy from our whole life. It's not the insult that was so damaging, it's our response to it. You have heard the phrase, pain is inevitable, misery is optional. I have met folks in care facilities with memory loss, and they don't remember a lot, but strikingly, they do remember some hurt or injustice from decades ago. It makes them feel miserable. They can recount it to you in detail, sometimes repeatedly. It has shaped their lives. Perseveration can poison your life, and that's a tragedy. You have one life to live, and living the same day over and over when you have other options, that's tragic. The leaking pipe makes a great analogy. The problem with the pipe was not nearly as bad as what happened afterward. When we allow unfortunate events or situations to destroy our lives, it's tragic. Perseverating on problems or negative encounters is like water damage. It can be so destructive if we allow it to be. Our thoughts matter. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Be careful what you think, because your thoughts run your life." So, how do we create a more joyful life? Well, today we've talked about taking an appraisal of our situation, how to recognize which things are actionable, which things we have agency over, and things that we have no control over. We've talked about the importance of our thought life and our attitudes. And we've reflected on how it's important not to perseverate on hurts or insults or other matters that steal our joy. Now we turn our focus to how we open ourselves to God. How do we open ourselves to God's work in our lives in 2021? How do we encounter God? And how do we receive God's messages? How do we experience the joy that God has in store for us? A wonderful start is to fix our gaze, to focus on what we are looking for. And if that is God, we look for God. This week we had an unusual opportunity to view the Christmas star, the crossing of Jupiter and Saturn in their orbits. They created a lovely bright light in the southwest sky just about the time of sundown. Now on Monday I was in Knoxville running errands, and it was cloudy. And by the time I got home, I missed being able to see it. But later that evening, I mistakenly pointed out another star to my family members, thinking that I had identified it. But later that evening, I researched into what exactly it should look like. I set my timer to remind myself to look the next evening, and I texted my friends that night to verify. And then I dragged everyone outside again to see this time the real thing. I could have very easily missed the whole thing, totally missed the opportunity. And the same is true for our encounters with God. It is important that we fix our gaze. It is important that we prioritize, that we make time for things that we want to, and that we set reminders for ourselves to do the things that we want to do. It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of our lives and to get distracted. Paul reminded Christians in Corinth to keep their focus. He says in 2 Corinthians 4:18, "So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever." Life is certainly filled with many distractions and challenges, and it is filled with many things to do. Are we available to hear God's messengers? Are we open to God's voice as it speaks to our conscience or through our intuition? Do we take time to be quiet, opening ourselves to God's presence? Do we heed the words of the messengers who offer words of wisdom? Sometimes these words may upturn our perceptions or our plans, like they did for Joseph when he learned of Herod's plot. But perhaps such messages may spare us much heartache later. This year, let's fix our gaze. Let's not be distracted by the troubles that come our way, but think rather about things that cannot be seen, as Paul says. There's a person who is a great example of this. As a child, Bethany Hamilton loved to surf. It was no surprise because her family was really into surfing. They popped her on a surfboard when she was about 4 years old. And by the time she was 8, she had begun competing, and she had plans to become a professional surfer. But on October 31st of 2003, she was attacked by a 14-foot tiger shark, and it took her arm. During the accident, she lost over 60% of her blood and could have easily died, but her friend's dad saved her life by cleverly creating a compress and binding her wounds. As she was rushed to the hospital, one of the EMTs had a special message for her, whispering into her ear, "The Lord will never leave you or forsake you." What's amazing about Bethany is that she kept her focus. Through her recovery, she focused on her faith. She fixed her gaze. As a young child, she had dedicated her life to Christ, and even in this most difficult challenge, she chose to focus on what God would have in store for her. Her big dreams seemed dashed entirely, yet she recognized God's work in her life, and she later said, "God did have something bigger planned for me. What we all needed to do was to trust and believe." She did not focus on the terrible event. She did not perseverate about what she could have done differently. She did not develop an aversion to the oceans or a hatred of sharks. In fact, once she responded to reporters that she knew that she surfed in the shark's natural home. What had happened to her wasn't her fault, nor was it the sharks. Within a month of her injury, she was back on the surfboard. She fixed her gaze. By January 2004, she entered her first major competition. Her tale led to a 2004 book, a documentary, and in 2011, a feature film, Soul Surfer. Over the years, she has traveled the world sharing her story, telling about her faith and encouraging others to face their fears, to be tenacious, and to trust in God. Gratitude is a theme in my life, she says. Appreciation is how I was able to quickly shift my mindset after losing my arm. Instead of focusing on what I didn't like about my body or my limitations, I chose to be grateful for the remarkable body that I have. It was a terrible thing that happened to me, but so many good things have come out of it that it has turned into a beautiful thing. Her openness to what God might have in store for her enabled her to turn a tragedy into an opportunity. I have thought about this every second of my life, she says. Why me? Not negatively, like, why did this terrible thing happen to me? But more like, why did God choose me? And what does God have in mind for me? Amazingly, she said, I think that if I can help other people find hope in God, then that is worth losing my arm for. Wow, that's something. It's easy for us to wish for a better day that was either in the past or hope for a better day in the future. It's easy for us to fall into the doldrums, our eyes and ears dulled to God's messengers, missing God's presence as we're caught up with perseverating. But Hamilton closed one interview with this comment: being present means living your actual life, accepting it for what it is, and making the absolute most of it. Each of us has so much to live for, so much to be grateful for, so many ways that we can serve God in the world. Let us do the absolute most with what we have. Each day is a precious opportunity. May we be open to God's Spirit in our lives. May we be attuned to God's messages. This Friday, when your alarm goes off in the morning, although it may be another bleak midwinter day, let us set out to begin that new day, that new month, and this new year ready for action.
Angels we have heard.